On a summer evening in Portland, a bartender is mixing cocktails and mocktails at the city's only lesbian bar. It's called Doc Marie's, and it's named after Dr. Marie Equi, who lived in Portland at the turn of the 20th century. The bar's co-owner, Olga Bichko, was very excited to tell me why they named the bar for Dr. Equi.
We love that she was in Portland, and just the way that she fought for people, stood up for herself, was an out lesbian at that time, was absolutely amazing. And so it felt like the perfect fit.
I also met Julia Clark-Cortez and Kaylee Monty, who'd both come in to enjoy some drinks and karaoke.
Dr. Marie's is like the only one place truly in Portland where I feel like I can be myself. I can go to the bathroom by myself. I can come out in front of my partner by myself and just be myself as a whole. Men aren't going to come at me and be like, oh, what are you doing tonight,
A space where women feel safe in queer culture is huge because there's not a lot of places in the whole U.S. that are like lesbian bars. And to have a space that's like named after someone that's so badass is like really cool. Like, you know what I mean? It's actually named after like queer history. That's amazing, interesting queer history. And to like be able to learn that, to me personally, is really interesting and great.
I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast about the place you call home. So who was this badass woman who became the namesake for Portland's only lesbian bar? I am simply thrilled to tell you about her, so let's get into it. Marie Equi was born in 1872. She became known as a radical, and she lived an extraordinary life. She was a fierce advocate for women's rights and reproductive freedom, as well as an activist for workers' rights. According to her biographer, Doc Marie's is aptly named.
Marie Equi was a doctor. She really identified as a doctor. She was nicknamed Doc.
Michael Hellquist's biography of Marie Equi came out in 2015. He explained that becoming a doctor was a good fit for her in many ways.
She knew she was not going to have a man in her life that was paying her way with anything. She had to be independent. She just knows I work best in an environment where I'm in charge.
The word lesbian was not commonly used around the turn of the century, but Marie Equi was romantically involved with other women, and she didn't try to hide that. She moved to Oregon from her hometown of New Bedford, Massachusetts, to join a female companion, Bessie Holcomb. Bessie and Marie first met in school back in New Bedford, and Holcomb moved west to become a homesteader. President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act in 1862, encouraging primarily white people to claim land the federal government had stolen from Native people. Homesteading offered white women a pathway to land ownership, and with it, a new level of independence. 30 years after Lincoln signed the law, Bessie Holcomb took advantage of this opportunity and staked a claim in Oregon outside the Dalles.
Marie didn't have any other options in New Bedford. And I imagine Bessie wrote letters to Marie and said, well, come join me.
So, at the age of 20, Marie Equi became an Oregonian. She had a bit of a hot temper, and in 1893, this led to her first arrest. Bessie was a school teacher, and her boss was a Baptist minister named O.D. Taylor. He offered Bessie a raise, but then reneged, and Marie was furious. So she grabbed a horsewhip.
And she started pacing in front of O.D. Taylor's office. He only had one way out, which was the front door, and she knew that. So here's this 20-year-old woman stalking back and forth and yelling out to him and causing a commotion. Finally, he came out, and she whacked him with the horsewhip, and she chased him up the street.
The Dalles Chronicle called Marie, quote, a queen. Apparently, O.D. Taylor was pretty unpopular in town. Now, she was arrested for horsewhipping him. The local police charged her with assault and disturbing the peace. Those charges were dropped, and she didn't spend any time in jail. But this was far from her last brush with the law.
She was very passionate in what she believed, causes she believed in, how the world should be.
The Homestead Act required Marie and Bessie to work the land for 5 years in order to own it. After that, the couple moved to San Francisco, where they eventually broke up. Marie decided to go to medical school. She interned in Pendleton, Oregon, and in 1905, she moved to Portland to start her own practice focused on women and children. She was a very active citizen. She joined the Progressive Party and advocated for women's suffrage. She also met and fell in love with Harriet Speckert, an heiress to the Olympia Brewing Company fortune.
The Speckert family, they accused Equi of being after the family wealth, but it was all about money, and of course it was all about what clearly was a lesbian relationship and the scandal of that.
Well, despite her family's disapproval, Harriet and Marie's relationship endured. In 1915, they adopted a baby girl together.
The people at the adoption agency knew she was a lesbian, knew she was living with another woman, and still allowed her to legally adopt. So she was probably the first and only for a very long time to do that.
Harriet was the primary parent, while Marie continued to focus on her medical practice. Around this time, she became increasingly focused on activism. In 1913, she stepped up to support striking workers at a Portland fruit cannery. The workers, who were all women, were demanding better pay and working conditions. They held up signs that said, quote, 40 cents a day is what makes prostitutes. Women demand a living wage. Basically saying the reason women were turning to sex work was because they had no other option that would pay them enough money to live.
Marie was making a house call, and she saw one of her patients there. She got on top of the soapbox, and she urged women to stop working, to join the strike. And that was the beginning of her radical period.
I mean, she was already pretty radical at this point, right? Remember, she had already been arrested for horsewhipping a guy. But anyway, when the police came in to arrest protesters at the fruit cannery, Marie and others fought back. Her weapon of choice this time was a hat pin. This was a woman who was resourceful when she was being stepped to. She did not come to play. She was arrested and taken to the county jail, where she said police beat her and spit on her. It didn't stop her, though. Coming up after a break, Marie continued to be a badass, but it was impossible to be an openly gay feminist labor activist without facing some consequences. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you dig what you hear, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll brighten your Monday morning a little bit with something new and exciting to listen to each week. You can also follow OPB on Instagram at OPBphoto, or follow me directly at Jen Chavez OPB, that is Jen with 2 N's, and I'll keep you posted on what Team Evergreen is up to. And remember, this episode about Marie Equi and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on this show is made possible by the support of many thousands of OPB members. That's the beauty of public media, my friends. Support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to the show. In the early 1900s, abortion was illegal in Oregon, as it was in most places. But Marie Equi provided her patients with a full spectrum of reproductive care, and that included abortions.
I think she just said, I know it's against the law, but considering her clients, I think she figured she could get away with it, because she provided abortions to the wives and the girlfriends of many prominent men in town. She had a great reputation for being safe.
Marie Equi also provided abortion and other health care to people who couldn't afford to pay her very much. Sometimes she didn't charge these patients at all.
This was a really important part of her philosophy about all all health care, all reproductive rights.
Kimberly Jensen is a professor of history and gender studies at Western Oregon University.
We know that she wanted very much to help working women, to help women in immigrant communities. She wanted to make sure that people had access to contraception, to abortion, regardless of what their job was or how much they made or who their family was.
Marie aligned herself with other radical activists who shared her values. That included Margaret Sanger, a sex educator and birth control advocate. Sanger came to Portland in 1916, and she brought along an educational pamphlet
about family limitation. It was like a small size that would fit in your purse or pocket, and it gave some basic information on how to avoid pregnancy.
According to historian Heather Meyer, that wasn't the only information Sanger included in her booklet.
It also described sex as something that could maybe be pleasurable for young women. And to even the progressives in the city of Portland who said they agreed that birth control information should be out there, but this pamphlet took it too far because it also talked about things that could arise impure thoughts in young people.
Perhaps you will not be surprised to learn Margaret Sanger and Marie Equi were both arrested for distributing the pamphlet because it was considered obscene material. As kind of a compromise, Marie agreed to revise the booklet. She took out the quote-unquote suggestive material that Portland officials had objected to.
And then she added a few of her own specialties. She named labor leaders in Portland who supported birth control, and she was advising women about not being too eager to have children. Basically, she was saying, don't raise your sons to be cannon fodder.
This was the year before the United States officially entered World War I, and the federal government had already started equating preparing for war with American patriotism. According to Kimberly Jensen, Marie's anti-war views were very much in line with the rest of her values.
Marie Equi shared with many labor activists, with many political radicals, the idea that the United States was becoming involved in World War I for corporate profit and not to make the world safe for democracy, as Woodrow Wilson would later claim.
During a preparedness parade, basically promoting the war effort in Portland, Marie drove her car onto the parade route with a banner that said, "Prepare to die, working men." For real. She was surrounded by people who disagreed with her.
And they blocked her car and started threatening her and pushing her around, and she fought back. There were agents of the Department of Justice and what became the FBI out here, and they sent reports back to Washington.
Marie was labeled as a troublemaker, and her anti-war actions led to much more serious consequences for her than any of her previous activism. Along with America's entrance into the war in 1917 came the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act.
With these acts, basically, you could not say anything bad about the government or the flag or the military or the war. Any type of speech or writing that would go against any of that put you at risk. It was a very wide net.
But Marie continued to speak out against the war. She gave many speeches at the International Workers of the World Hall in Portland. Mixed in with the IWW members in the audience for at least one of these speeches were some federal agents. They reported that she had called members of the military scum in her speech.
She never denied her anti-war views or that she did give these speeches, but she did deny that particular statement.
There was no recording of the event, so it was basically her word against the federal agents. Guess who the government believed? She was arrested and indicted for sedition in 1918. After being released on bail, Marie spent the next 5 months being surveilled by federal agents as the prosecution built a case against her. There was even a female agent who was assigned to pretend to be Marie's friend so that she could report on her activities and statements. This agent reported to Bureau of Investigation Agent William Bryan. Mr. Bryan was not a fan of Marie Equi.
I believe that he was disgusted that she was a woman who loved other women, and he talked about her and her kind. She symbolized everything that he thought was evil.
She went on trial for sedition in November of 1918 with an IWW attorney as her defense counsel. It was very hard to prove that she didn't say what she was accused of saying. And her association with the International Workers of the World, along with the findings that the government agents had collected about her, made it pretty much impossible for her to win.
The prosecution made a comment about, we can't let this unsexed woman stay free.
Marie Equi was found guilty of 5 counts of sedition and sentenced to 3 years in San Quentin prison. She got into a physical altercation with William Bryan on her way out of the courtroom.
I think he initiated it and shoved Marie, kind of threw her to the ground.
Claiming, of course, later that she had threatened to kill him in the past, but also knocked over Harriet Speckert.
And then he quickly left.
And, of course, she appealed her conviction. It took 2 years and went all the way to the Supreme Court, which upheld her conviction. In 1920, President Woodrow Wilson commuted her sentence. She served 10 months and 1 day in prison and returned home in 1921. Harriet Speckert died a few years later, and their adopted daughter came to live with Marie. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt pardoned Marie Equi, along with hundreds of people who had been convicted of sedition during the First World War.
She fought for so many things that she didn't have to fight for. She knew that what she was advocating for was important to improve people's lives.
Marie suffered a heart attack in 1930, but survived and lived a quiet life after that. She died in 1952 at the age of 80.
She was one of a kind. She didn't need to put a label on herself because she was living her life the way she wanted to and the way in her mind she should.
In addition to the bar named after her in Portland, there is also a plaque honoring Marie Equi on the Rainbow Honor Walk in San Francisco's Castro district.
Here's an activist, lesbian, radical who's being honored. It makes me really, really pleased and excited.
Honestly, it makes me really excited too. There are some people in Oregon's history books who did terrible, awful things that we're still reckoning with today. And some people in Oregon's history who were ahead of their time, who pushed for rights that we enjoy and perhaps even take for granted. But Marie, I think, was a true radical, even by modern standards. I mean, she provided free, illegal abortions to women in poverty. She staged an anti-war protest by herself at a World War I rally. And as we heard, she was arrested over and over and over again for standing up for her beliefs, and she continued to do so despite that. To learn about someone like this in our state's history, whose life is still being honored now, was personally, for me, exhilarating. I had so much fun talking to people at Doc Marie's about the bar's namesake. I got to tell Yam Rivera a little bit about Marie Equi, and then we had this exchange. So what do you think?
Icon.
You can see the Oregon Experience documentary about Marie Equi at opb.org. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Julie Sabatier produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray, who also engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada and Sage Van Wing, Nadine Jelsing, Lisa Swin Callum, Brandon Swanson, and Todd Sonfleeth did the interviews you heard. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. And if you ever have a question for us, please reach out. You can hit us up by email at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.